The most inbred Habsburg royal who ever lived. If you wander the halls of the Museo del Prado in Madrid, you might pause before a portrait by Juan Carreño de Miranda. It depicts a man who looks impossibly old, yet he is barely middle-aged. His jaw juts forward, his mouth hangs open, and his eyes carry a profound weariness. That man was Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. He wasn't just a king, he was the living, breathing, suffering final chapter of a genetic story that stretched back centuries. His life was less a reign and more a prolonged tragedy, a medical enigma that scientists are still trying to unravel today. Charles II was the most inbred monarch in a dynasty infamous for it, and his body was the ledger where nature tallied the cost of his family's obsession with blood purity. His story begins long before his birth in 1661. It starts with a philosophy of power that saw marriage not as a personal union but as a political tool. The Habsburgs had a famous motto, "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." This wasn't just a romantic quip, it was a strategic doctrine. They expanded their empire across Europe through a web of carefully arranged unions, acquiring vast territories without drawing a sword. But there was a dark corollary to this strategy, a deep, almost pathological need to keep those territories within the family. To prevent their hard-won lands from falling into the hands of outsiders, the Habsburgs began to intermarry with stunning regularity. Uncles married nieces, first cousins married first cousins, and the family tree, which should have branched out beautifully, began to fold in on itself, becoming a tangled, thorny bush. For generations, this practice tightened its grip. The genetic pool became shallower with each union. The infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, became the family's trademark, a physical manifestation of their inward-turning genetics. In a perverse way, it was a mark of their lineage, a sign that you belonged to the most powerful family in Europe. But what was a curiosity in one generation became a debilitating deformity in the next. The path to Charles II was a relentless march of consanguinity. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. This makes Charles's ancestry a genetic maze. His father was also his great-uncle, his mother was also his cousin. His family tree wasn't a tree at all, it was a wreath, a closed loop where the same genetic material was passed around, amplified, and corrupted. To put a cold, hard number on it, geneticists have calculated a metric called the inbreeding coefficient. This number represents the probability that an individual inherits two identical copies of a gene from a shared ancestor. The child of two siblings would have a of 0.25. Charles II of Spain had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. Let that sink in. He was more genetically homogeneous than a person whose parents were brother and sister. This was the genetic reality that shaped his existence from the moment of conception. The birth of Charles on November 6, 1661, was met with a collective sigh of relief across Spain. The empire desperately needed a healthy male heir. What it got was a child who, from the very beginning, seemed to struggle against the very fact of being alive. The French ambassador, seeing the infant, sent a chilling report back to his king. He described a child who seems quite weak, shows signs of degeneration, he has phlegm on his cheeks, his head is full of scabs, and his neck is draining. He frightens with his ugliness. This was the robust male the official gazette had proclaimed to the kingdom. His childhood was a slow-motion confirmation of those early fears. Charles was a sickly baby, plagued by constant catarrh, diarrhea, and a worrying lack of muscle tone. A rotation of 14 wet nurses sustained him until he was 4 years old, a practice deemed indecorous for a monarch only after he ascended the throne at that tender age. His developmental milestones were not delayed, they were a monumental struggle. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4, and his speech, when it came, was thick and barely intelligible, a lifelong result of an oversized tongue and that deformed jaw that made chewing a physical impossibility. He did not walk until he was 8 years old. In a world where royal children were meticulously prepared for rule, Charles was treated as an infant until he was 10, his caretakers too fearful to overtax his fragile constitution. His education was all but abandoned. After all, who would prepare a boy who seemed destined for the grave for the duties of a throne? He was left to a state of profound indolence, at times not even expected to keep himself clean. The clinical picture of his youth is a litany of physical and neurological horrors. A cascade of infectious diseases washed over him: measles and chickenpox at 6, rubella at 10, smallpox at 11. On top of this, his body was racked by epileptic seizures until he was 15. His single recognized pastime was shooting, a lonely activity he occasionally engaged in at the preserves of El Escorial. The world saw a king, but inside the palace walls was a deeply disabled child, trapped in a body that was betraying him from the inside out. His jaw was so severely deformed, an extreme case of the Habsburg jaw, that he could barely speak or eat, and his tongue was so large he frequently drooled. As he aged, his body continued to present a baffling and grotesque array of symptoms. He was described as short, lame, and prematurely senile, losing all his hair by the age of 35. He endured chronic gastric problems, partly from his gluttony for chocolate, but mostly because his severe prognathism made the act of chewing almost impossible. He was condemned to a life of soft foods and broths, his dietary world as limited as his physical one. Modern researchers, poring over the historical accounts and portraits, have proposed a dizzying array of retrospective diagnoses, each an attempt to fit his constellation of suffering into a modern medical box. Some endocrinologists have seen in him a case of combined pituitary hormone deficiency, a genetic disorder causing a shortfall in many essential hormones, explaining his stunted growth and lack of energy. Others point to distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that would cause the corrosion in his organs and his profound bone weakness. Later theories have included Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal condition causing infertility and small testicles, and even the rare genetic disorder aspartylglucosinuria, which could explain his facial features, developmental delay, and recurrent infections. The truth is likely a horrifying combination of several of these, all unlocked by the relentless grinding of recessive genes against each other in a body with no genetic diversity to protect it. This physical decay played out on the grandest stage imaginable. Charles II was a king, and the survival of the Spanish throne depended on him producing an heir. It was a task he was biologically incapable of performing. His first marriage, to the bright and beautiful Marie-Louise d'Ins, was a human tragedy. She was a vivacious French princess who found herself married to a physical and intellectual ruin of a man. For 10 years, the kingdom watched her belly with desperate hope, but she remained a virgin. Her letters home to France were cries of despair, one famously stating, "The king has not really entered my life." The marriage was never consummated, likely a consequence of the severe hypogonadism and hypogenitalism that modern scientists attribute to his genetic disorders. When Marie-Louise died in 1689, perhaps from appendicitis, an autopsy confirmed what everyone had silently suspected: her uterus was perfectly intact. A year later, with the succession crisis growing more desperate, Charles married again. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a woman from a famously fertile family. Her own mother had given birth to 23 children. But again, no heir came. The pressure on the Queen was immense, and she resorted to a series of simulated pregnancies, announcements of a coming heir that turned out to be phantom illusions born of desperation. The court was consumed by anxiety. The greatest empire in the world was about to crumble for lack of a child, and at its center was a man whose body was incapable of fathering one. It was in this atmosphere of utter desperation that the court turned to a diagnosis that reflected the superstition of the age more than any medical reality. The king's physical and mental state, his convulsions, his impotence, his strange visage, was so beyond comprehension that it was concluded he was not ill, but bewitched. He became known, and history remembers him, as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. A formal investigation into the supernatural was launched in 1698. It concluded that the king had been cursed at the age of 14, with a hex so powerful it had stolen his health, his throne, and his virility. The spell, it was determined, had been slipped into a cup of chocolate, a gruesome potion made from the brains of an executed man to take away his governance, entrails to ruin his health, and kidneys to corrupt his semen. The only remedy was a brutal exorcism. Priests and exorcists were brought in. Charles, already weak and suffering, was subjected to horrific treatments designed to drive the demons from his body. He was forced to consume revolting concoctions, his body was rubbed with hot oils, and his soul was harried with prayers and rituals. The treatments, predictably, only worsened his delicate condition. The true demon tormenting Charles II lived not in any spirit realm, but in the very chromosomes of his cells, a curse laid by his own ancestors. The end, when it came in 1700, was as miserable as the life that preceded it. His body, racked with edema so severe his tongue was too swollen for speech, was in terminal collapse. He suffered from constant diarrhea, high fevers, and a profound, unshakable weakness. He could barely stand. 2 days before his death, he fell into a coma. He died on November 1st, just shy of his 39th birthday, a man who, at 30, had looked like a man of 70. Then came the final, gruesome act. An autopsy was performed, and the attending physician documented what he saw. The report reads like a Gothic horror story. He found a heart that was the size of a peppercorn, lungs that were corroded, intestines that were putrefied and gangrenous. In his kidney, 3 large stones. He had a single testicle, which was described as being black as coal. And inside his skull, he found a head full of water. Each gruesome detail was a physical testament to the cumulative genetic disaster of over 2 centuries of inbreeding. The Habsburg dynasty in Spain did not just end, it was extinguished in a clinical, biological catastrophe. His death without a direct heir did exactly what his ancestors had so obsessively tried to avoid. It plunged Europe into chaos. The spoils of the massive Spanish Empire were up for grabs, and the great powers fell upon each other in the War of the Spanish Succession. The conflict was long and bloody, ultimately placing a French Bourbon prince, Philip V, on the Spanish throne, where his descendants remain today. The generations of cousins marrying cousins, all to keep the blood pure and the power within the family, resulted in the complete loss of that power and the end of their genetic line. Charles II's reproductive failure, the terminal point of the family's genetic crash, was the direct and proximate cause of the dynasty's extinction. The story of Charles II is a deeply human one, stripped of the crown and scepter. He was a man who was born into immense privilege and unspeakable suffering, a man who spent his life as a public spectacle of decay, and who died knowing his body had failed him in the most fundamental and public of ways. He was called the Bewitched, and perhaps he was bewitched not by a rival's hex, but by a curse of his own blood, a pathological obsession with purity that can only ever lead to the most profound form of corruption. His legacy is not one of political achievement or military conquest. His legacy is a stark, terrifying, and deeply saddening scientific lesson, a portrait painted in pain, a life that stands as a monument to the truth that in the genetic lottery, diversity is not just strength, it is survival. The tragedy of Charles II is not merely a matter of his physical suffering, it is a story of how his body, this vessel of royal power, became a psychological prison. The court that surrounded him was a hothouse of intrigue, where every cough, every stumble, every slurred word was analyzed for signs of impending death. As he grew into adolescence, it became painfully clear that he would never truly govern. Power, that most potent of elixirs, flowed around him but never through him. His mother, Mariana of Austria, served as regent during his childhood, and her grip on authority was only matched by her terror of losing it. She kept her son in a state of deliberate infantilism. It was said that for the first 10 years of his life, he was not allowed to walk more than a few steps for fear he would fall. He was carried everywhere, swaddled not in the clothes of a prince but in the anxieties of a court that saw him as a flickering candle in a gale. This physical coddling robbed him of whatever small chance he had for normal musculoskeletal development. His legs remained weak, his frame frail. The psychological impact of this treatment is unimaginable. To be a king in name, yet to be treated as an invalid incapable of the simplest self-care, must have created a profound fracture in his sense of self. He was a living paradox, the most powerful man in the world who could not even feed himself properly. His daily life was a meticulously choreographed ritual of futility. The ceremonies of the Spanish court, already renowned for their ossified formality, became grim pantomimes around his person. The ritual of the royal meal, for instance, was an agonizing display. With his oversized tongue and jutting jaw, Charles could only consume soft, pappy foods. Yet the elaborate procession of dishes, the genuflecting courtiers, and the rigid protocol remained in place. He would sit, the Habsburg jaw making it impossible to close his mouth, as a parade of food he could not eat was presented to him. His real diet, when he ate at all, consisted of soups, broths, and a particularly ruinous quantity of chocolate. His love for this exotic drink, thick with sugar and spices, was one of the few indulgences he could manage, and it likely contributed to his chronic gastric distress and his edentulous state. He lost his teeth early, further compounding his dietary woes. The court physicians, steeped in Galenic humoral theory, bled him, purged him, and dosed him with herbal concoctions that were utterly useless against the genetic storm raging inside his cells. His life was not a life. It was a long, slow, public autopsy. The political ramifications of his condition were catastrophic, unfolding in slow motion over his 39-year reign. Spain, the colossal empire where the sun never set, was a giant with a void at its center. The king could not lead armies, could not master complex diplomatic negotiations, and could barely stay awake through council meetings. Into this power vacuum rushed the grandees of Spain and the machinating queens. His mother, Mariana, had relied heavily on her Austrian confessor, the Jesuit Johann Eberhard Nithard, a man who became a lightning rod for Spanish xenophobia and courtly resentment. This led to years of internal strife, subtly encouraged by Louis XIV of France, who was waiting like a vulture for the carcass of the Spanish Empire to fall into his grasp. When Charles was finally declared of age, he was no more capable of rule than he had been as a child. He leaned heavily on a series of favorites, or validos, who attempted to govern in his name. But the fundamental problem remained: there was no ultimate source of authority. A valido could be toppled by a whisper, a letter, or a change in the king's mercurial, disease-clouded mind. Spanish power, once the terror of Europe, became a listless, drifting hulk, gradually beached on the shores of irrelevance. The famous Spanish infantry, the tercios, saw defeat at Rocroi long before his birth, but under his reign, the military and administrative decay accelerated because the head of the body politic was dying. The search for an heir became the obsessive, all-consuming neurosis of his 2 marriages, and it is here that the human cost of the inbreeding becomes most painfully intimate. His first wife, Marie-Louise Dunes, was the niece of Louis XIV, a beautiful, blonde, and vivacious girl who loved riding, dancing, and the sophisticated pleasures of the French court. To marry her to Charles II was to sentence her to a living death. The suffocating etiquette of the Spanish court, The rigoroso estilo shocked her. She was forbidden to speak to men, to look out of windows, or to touch her own clothes, which were dressed on her by ladies-in-waiting. But the true horror was her private life with the king. Her desperate letters to France, a carefully coded stream of misery, paint a picture of a man with no sexual instinct, a body incapable of the act required to save the kingdom. The problem of Charles's sexual function consumed the court. Physicians plied him with aphrodisiacs, astrologers cast horoscopes for the perfect moment of conception, and theologians debated whether the king's impotence was physical or the result of the alleged bewitchment. The pressure on Marie-Louise was intolerable. She was blamed by the court for the lack of an heir, her French origins making her a convenient target. When she fell ill with violent stomach pains, the whispers of poison, a sinister tool in the diplomatic arsenal of the time, began immediately. She died in agony, confessing on her deathbed, "Your Majesty, I have not failed you in what is essential, I do not die of what you think." The sentence is haunting. She had not failed him, for there was nothing she could do. The failure was locked in his genome. Her replacement, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was a very different character. She was tough, politically astute, and from a family of legendary fertility, a fact that gave hope that she might succeed where her predecessor had failed. But the biological reality was inescapable. The most detailed forensic examination of Charles's condition, published centuries later, proposed that Charles suffered from a combination of disorders, with a prime candidate being combined pituitary hormone deficiency, leading to a profound state of hypogonadism. This would mean his levels of testosterone and other crucial hormones were catastrophically low from birth. He likely never went through puberty in any meaningful sense. His voice, when it could be understood, was said to be high-pitched. His body was hairless and childlike in its proportions. The single, atrophied testicle found at his autopsy, black as coal, was not just a gruesome detail, it was the definitive physical evidence of complete reproductive failure. Maria Anna, for all her political will, could do nothing. Her phantom pregnancies, announced with great fanfare only to dissolve into nothing, were acts of political theatre born of sheer terror. Every fake delivery was a temporary staving off of the wolves, a message to Europe that all was not yet lost. But it was. The body of the king was the tomb of his dynasty. The bewitchment narrative, which culminates in the exorcisms, is perhaps the most psychologically revealing chapter of his life. It demonstrates a medieval mindset grappling with a reality it could not comprehend. The concept of genetics was centuries in the future. The court could not understand how a man born of such noble, ancient bloodlines could be so monstrously defective, unless supernatural foul play was involved. The investigation into the hex was a serious affair, involving theologians from the University of Salamanca and the Inquisition. They traced the curse to an incident when he was 14, supposedly involving a spell cast by a rival faction using the king's own chocolate. The detailed specificity of the cursed potion's effects, brains for mental incapacity, entrails for corrupted health, kidneys for barrenness, is a grotesque mirror image of his actual symptoms. The exorcisms themselves, led by the notorious exorcist Fray Antonio Alvarez Arguelles, were a form of torture. The king, already weak, was forced to fast, to ingest holy concoctions, and to endure terrifying rituals designed to command the demons to leave. He was convinced he was possessed. "Everything I have fills me with horror," he is reported to have said. "I am not a man, I am the most hideous monster in the world." His body was not just his own. It had become a battlefield between God and the devil, a public stage for a cosmic struggle. The psychological damage of this period must have been absolute, the final disintegration of any coherent sense of self. He was not a king, he was a haunted vessel. When we look at the portraits today, we see more than a record of a man. We see a clinical document. If you trace the evolution of the Habsburg jaw from the regal, slightly heavy chin of Charles V to the benign but pronounced underbite of Philip IV, and finally to the catastrophic deformity of Charles II, you are watching the inbreeding coefficient rise on canvas. Charles's face is the face of genetic exhaustion. The prognathism is so severe that his upper and lower teeth barely met. The tongue, far too large for his mouth, lolled constantly, giving him a permanently gormless, drooling expression. The painter Carreño de Miranda, in his famous full-length portrait of Charles in the Hall of Mirrors of the Alcázar, captured it all with a strange, unflinching honesty. The king stands in a palatial room, dressed in magnificent black velvet and gold, a globe, crown, and royal lion at his feet. He is surrounded by the symbols of his unrivaled power. Yet the face is a death mask. It is pale, elongated, and melancholic. The jaw juts forward, the mouth hangs slack. The painting is a perfect visual paradox, the most magnificent trappings in the world wrapped around a body in terminal decline. It is a portrait of a genetic shipwreck. Charles II was more than a person, he was a biological conclusion. The House of Habsburg had, for 2 centuries, practiced a form of unwitting genetic engineering, selecting for a deadly combination of recessive alleles. The inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, that shockingly high number that outstrips a child of a sibling union, essentially meant that 1/4 of his entire genome was completely homozygous, with identical copies of genes inherited from his common ancestors. The worst traits of his lineage, which might have been scattered and diluted in a healthy gene pool, were instead concentrated, amplified, and poured into the fragile frame of a single human being. The result was a man who, from the day he was born, was dying. He did not have a life, he had a succession of symptoms. He did not rule a kingdom, his kingdom mourned his life in advance. When he finally died, 5 days before his 39th birthday, it was not a shock but the expected, bitter end. The final lines of the physician's autopsy report are a fitting epitaph for a man and a dynasty destroyed by the very blood that was supposed to make them special. His body, the doctor wrote, did not contain a single drop of blood, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines putrefied and gangrenous, he had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. The vessel of power was empty, corrupted from the inside by the very purity his family had so jealously guarded. The lesson of Charles the Bewitched is written in his bones. In biology, as in life, isolating yourself in a fortress of your own blood is not a defense. It is the slowest, cruelest form of suicide.